Live from Washington, I'm Aisha Tanzim and you're watching Access Point. Hello and welcome. For decades, Saudi Arabia has used oil and the backing of the U.S. to maintain its grip on the region. But the Arab Spring and the election in Iran of an arguably moderate candidate forced the U.S. to readjust its policy for the Middle East. The Saudis felt deserted and threatened to go it alone. Today, we'll talk about the change in Saudi foreign policy and especially Pakistan's role in it. Why does Saudi Arabia need Pakistan and what does it need it for? Joining me in the studio is Dr. David Weinberg. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And in our London studio, we have Kamran Bukhari. He's the Vice President of Mideast and South Asian Affairs at intelligence firm Stratfor. Welcome to Access Point.
Thank you for having me.
I'll go over to London first because Mr. Bukhari has recently released a report about Saudi foreign policy. Mr. Bukhari, give me in bullet points, what have been the major changes or shifts in Saudi foreign policy recently?
I mean, after the United States, which is the historic ally of Saudi Arabia, the biggest ally of Saudi Arabia, after it's, from the Saudi point of view, the biggest ally went and started to negotiate with the biggest enemy of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis felt that they felt betrayed, and they said that we need to be able to fend for ourselves. We can no longer rely on the United States. Now, mind you, this is not something that happened after the Rouhani government and Obama administration began talking. This is a long time in the making, but eventually the backing away from the military option in Syria last August was the last straw that broke the camel's back. And so what the Saudis have decided that we have enough financial clout and we're punching below our weight, and we have been for many, many years, allowing the United States to take the lead. It's time we step up and pursue a more assertive foreign policy where we need to pursue our own interests, because obviously the United States is now trying to balance between Iran and the Arab states, and particularly Saudi Arabia. So they have embarked upon an ambitious foreign policy shift. It remains to be seen how far they can take this.
Let's talk a little bit about what are they trying to achieve in the region. In Egypt, they supported the military coup. The U.S. opposed it. In Syria, in Bahrain. Tell me, what are they trying to achieve here?
Sure. The Saudis have three main threats that they see in the region. One is Iran, one is Al-Qaeda, and the other is the Muslim Brotherhood. So in Egypt, their goal is to keep the Muslim Brotherhood down so it doesn't become a potential threat to internal stability in countries in the Gulf. Dealing with Iran and Iranian proxies throughout the region, the Saudis are determined to hold the line against them, even if it means finding ways around U.S. policy with regard to Iranian diplomacy. And then with Al-Qaeda, they've been listing Al-Qaeda groups as terrorists and imposing mandatory penalties on Saudis who fight for them.
Would you then say that the way Egyptian military cracked down on the Brotherhood, so harsh, declaring them a terrorist group, could some of that have come from Saudi Arabia, or was it the military itself?
Well, the Saudis were certainly supportive of it. When the Egyptian military pursued these sorts of approaches, the Saudi king had a speech given in his name in which he criticized anyone who gives Egypt trouble over this, saying that such criticism is merely fanning the flames of sedition. So the Saudis were certainly supportive. But I think that policy also was coming from the interim government in Egypt itself.
Okay, and let me bring Pakistan's role into this. Mr. Bukhari, we've recently seen a flurry of activity. Saudi defense minister, Saudi foreign minister in Pakistan, Pakistan's chief of army staff going to Saudi Arabia. What is Pakistan's role in this new shift in Saudi policy?
Well, Pakistan, as you know, historically has relied on the Saudis for a whole host of things, and primarily financial support. Pakistan is a very close ally of Saudi Arabia. So at this point in time, what do the Pakistanis need? A, they are cash-starved, and so they need some sort of an assistance. It's coming, but slowly. Secondly, Pakistan has an insurgency to deal with, and they feel that the Saudis can lend them a hand there because the Saudis have influence over the various actors. In return, the Saudis want Pakistan on their side in Syria They want Pakistan on their side, particularly against Iran. And that's where it becomes problematic, because Pakistan actually shares a border with Iran, which is becoming quite active because of anti-Iranian Sunni Islamist militant groups that are operating out of Pakistan and Afghanistan and striking inside Iran. And that's creating tensions. And so Pakistan is sort of sandwiched between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so let's take them one by one. He mentioned Syria first, and Pakistan's foreign minister recently said that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are on the same page about Syria. What does that mean? Only politically in the UN, or does that mean have practical manifestations on the ground, Dr. Weinberg?
Well, the media reports certainly suggest that it has practical manifestations on the ground, and that's certainly what the Saudis would like as well. The Saudis would like to see Pakistan providing support when it comes to training rebel forces within Syria, equipping them with anti-tank and anti-aircraft shoulder-mounted weapons, as well as providing basic diplomatic support. So the Saudis are trying to get a more concrete policy from the Pakistanis on this, as well as on Bahrain.
What do some of your intelligence reports tell you, Mr. Bukhari, about how far Pakistan is willing to go in Syria?
I think the Pakistanis have not made a decision yet. I think that they're still talking to the Saudis about this, because the Pakistanis have to look over the shoulder to the United States and make sure that the Pakistanis do not get into an arrangement with the Saudis that really upsets the American calculus. And therefore, Pakistan, again, is caught right in between, just as it's caught between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It's also dependent upon the United States. And obviously, the United States, from the Pakistani point of view, takes precedence. So I think that they said, yes, we'll help you. Maybe we can help you in some sort of a training. Obviously, this training is going to take place in Jordan, a place that Pakistani military is very familiar with, given the Pakistani support to the Jordanian monarchy back in 1970 with the putting down of Black September. So that is probably something that the Pakistanis are willing to do. Now, in terms of weapons, as David just mentioned, I think that crosses some sort of at least an orange, if not red line, because the United States does not want to alter the battlefield in a way that the weapons make their way to Al-Qaeda and characters like that.
And that red line that he's mentioned is important, but also in terms of training, U.S. is very concerned, so are Europeans, that the groups fighting in Syria, they cannot really distinguish who is who. Free Syrian Army, but then there are a lot of extremist groups there. So if training happens, how do they separate in which groups they train and which groups they do not?
Well, the CIA has reportedly been involved on the ground in Jordan, and no doubt there's a vetting component involved there. That having been said, Saudi clients inside Syria have flirted with extremism and really full-on al-Qaedism. So the Islamic Front, for instance, in Syria, which is arguably the largest military force among the rebels, includes lifelong fighters for al-Qaeda, primarily in Ahrar al-Sham, but this is a body that as a whole has received some Saudi support, at least through certain of its members. And we haven't seen these parts of the Islamic Front being designated as terrorists by the Saudis, for instance. So it's a whole mess. It's an alphabet soup of fighters, and among them are terrorists.
So, Mr. Bukhari, then we come to this very important point. Saudi Arabia recently banned some groups, declared them terrorists, Al-Qaeda amongst them. But if Al-Qaeda fighters are now fighting under a different umbrella and still getting Saudi money, how will that play out?
I think that David really hit the nail on the head, is that you have an alphabet soup of characters, so you can change names. It doesn't take long. You can put up a statement on Facebook or tweet it, or just go the old-fashioned way, and what you ultimately have are the same characters operating under different labels. And this is a very, very fluid landscape. I mean, primarily, there are all sorts of actors that fall under the rubric of Salafi Jihadi. Now, they may be nationalists in an Islamic Front, particularly Jaish al-Islam, which is the main proxy of the Saudis, led by Zahran al-Lush. And so, you got him on one side, nationalist jihadists, and then you have Daesh, which is also known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And then there's Jabhat al-Nusra, and the people have fought under different labels, and it depends upon geography as well, where you are, I mean, which group has the upper hand. So this is a fluid landscape. There's no way you can actually keep track of the weapons or even the personnel once they're in the battlefield.
Okay, now one interesting fact is when Saudi Arabia released the names of these groups that they declared terrorist groups, the Tehreek-e-Taliban in Pakistan, TTP, was not part of it, which is, by Pakistani standards, the enemy number one, the terrorist organization number one for Pakistan. What was Saudi Arabia trying to achieve here by not making them?
Yeah, the list that the Saudis released the other week is very significant, both in terms of the groups it includes as well as the groups it does not include. The Muslim Brotherhood was included, except the component of the Muslim Brotherhood that's most obviously tied to terrorism, Hamas in the Palestinian territories, was not listed. Hezbollah within the kingdom was listed, but Hezbollah's broader network, including in Lebanon, was not listed. And as you noted, Tehreek-e-Taliban was in Pakistan was not listed either. I think that's particularly significant because although the Saudi list did reserve the rights to apply similar penalties to groups blacklisted under the UN Security Council, such as the Taliban in Pakistan, the Pakistani government has called on Saudi Arabia to play a mediating role to try and get the Taliban to the negotiating table. And as such, the Saudis seem to be trying to maintain the ability to have a diplomatic channel with the Taliban.
How much influence, Mr. Bukhari, do Saudis have over TTP, and not listing them as a terrorist organization? Do you think they'll kind of nudge them towards the negotiating table?
I think that there is very little Saudi influence, and if there is, it's indirect, and I'll explain how. TTP is perhaps, according to some experts, the most established of all al-Qaeda allies around the world. Now, obviously, the Syrian ones are getting there, but the TTP, having forced the Pakistani state into negotiations, seems to be doing, pretty well. So if you're with al-Qaeda, there's no way you have any ties with the Saudi kingdom because al-Qaeda is at war with the Saudi kingdom, and they consider the Saudi kingdom as un-Islamic. So that really leaves the Saudis in a bind where they can't help the Pakistanis. Now, the way there is an indirect way, and that is the money trail. So, yes, the Saudi government doesn't have any financial linkages, not that I'm aware of, to TTP, but there are people inside Saudi Arabia and in the other GCC states, particularly Amarat, the United Arab Emirates, that the Saudis can squeeze and say, can you guys cut it off? Because our ally is getting hurt here. Now, are they actually going to do that? And if they have the intent, to what extent can they make a difference? That's still, up in the air.
Does it show something about a Saudi-Pakistan relationship that Saudi Arabia did not name TTP as a terrorist group, Mr. Bukhari?
As David was saying, Hezbollah in Saudi Arabia was named, but Hezbollah wasn't, although Hezbollah is called Hizb ut-Shaitan right now by the Saudis and their allies. And so I think this is an initial list. At some point, it's going to include others. But obviously, the Saudis, if they didn't put TTP on there, could be meaning one of two things. One is that they want to get something from Pakistan in return. They don't want to deliver on it until the Pakistanis have, upheld their end of the bargain. And the second thing is that it's not really high on the priority list of the Saudis. For them, Syria is the most important battlefield. Pakistan needs to focus on Syria from the Saudi point of view, and then, of course, the Saudis are going to help them on their internal issue, as well as Afghanistan.
Okay, let's move to the second country that you mentioned, that was Iran, Dr. Weinberg. Saudi Arabia is very upset that the U.S. is willing to even consider talks with Iran. This fear, is it a real fear of nuclear weapons, or is it more of a fear of if there are no more sanctions on Iran, it comes back into the oil markets and takes some of the Saudi edge away?
Saudi fear, you're asking?
Yes,
what's the
Saudi fear.
Well, I think the U.S. element is important for understanding why both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia are seeking to move closer together on defense relations. For Pakistan, I think it involves a question of how reliable is U.S. assistance in the aftermath of a potential withdrawal from Afghanistan. For the Saudis, it's primarily about Iran. but it's also about Syria. So in Syria, they feel that the United States didn't deliver on what they see as the global civilian calamity of our age. And then on Iran, they see the United States embracing a regime that has not stopped its subversion activities throughout the Arab world. And so the Saudis really see a two-pronged threat from Iran. One is the subversion activities, and the other is the nuclear element. And the meaning of the nuclear element gets interpreted through these subversion activities to really convince the Saudis that the Iranians are not turning over a new leaf.
But how much of it is a practical concern about keeping a hold on the oil markets?
Well, the Saudis would certainly love to see Iran kept off the oil market indefinitely. The Gulf states have an important role as a swing supplier when it comes to global oil markets, keeping prices relatively stable where they are. But if you bring 2-3 million barrels a day of Iranian oil onto the market, that forces these states to actually cut back their production if they want to keep prices relatively stable, which means enormous cuts to their budgets.
So let me bring Mr. Bukhari in, and in terms of intelligence and security, which we know is always very closely linked to finance, how much of a problem will it be for Saudi Arabia if Iranian oil comes into the market?
I think that the threat is not immediate because the Iranian energy sector is in shambles. It's going to take a while for it to really start pumping oil and get to a level where it becomes a threat for the Saudis. The Saudis pump far more oil than the Iranians. And they're more worried, from the Saudi point of view, they're more worried about Iraq because Iraq is touching 3 million barrels per day, and so it's going to go up. And they don't want it to become, and according to, if you go by the reports, there's a lot of potential there that we can go to 6 million, and perhaps another decade it could even touch what the Saudis are producing right now, assuming all sorts of other things continue to remain as is and Iraq doesn't further plunge into chaos. But from the Iranian point of view, I think the threat for the Saudis is that Iran, under sanctions, was making inroads into the Arab world and really stepping on Saudi Arabia's toes, undermining Saudi influence, creating problems, trying to exploit the Arab Spring. And if Iran is unencumbered by sanctions, then they say that kind of activity is just going to exponentially rise. I think that's the issue. I don't even think that they're really worried about the nuclear issue because that requires a set of technology that the Iranians don't have to be able to produce a deliverable weapon. They can have enriched uranium, they can have like a North Korean device, but I doubt that they'll be able to have deliverable nuclear weapons anytime soon.
So let me talk about Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Pakistan. The biggest thing right now is Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline. The current government seems to be dragging its feet. It says it's shelved, and then says, no, we're committed to it, and no, it's really shelved. How much of it is U.S. sanctions, Dr. Weinberg, and how much of it is Saudi pressure?
I think the Saudi pressure is essential as part of this equation. The U.S. sanctions have been on the table for quite some time, and in fact discouraged the Indians from pursuing this as fervently years ago. But that wasn't sufficient for dissuading Pakistan on this issue, in part because Pakistan's energy needs are so significant, and in part because the Zardari government was really interested in pursuing this. The Sharif government, on the other hand, is more favorable to Saudi concerns on this issue, as well as interested in trying to build a stronger relationship with Saudi Arabia on a range of issues, and as such is much more favorable when Saudi diplomats and other officials come to Pakistan and say, hey, we've got real concerns about this pipeline and we really think you shouldn't move forward. And just this week we saw news that Saudi Arabia is providing Pakistan with $3 billion in loans, half of which has already been provided. And so this could be seen by some perhaps as a payoff for avoiding pursuit of a pipeline.
Okay, so this is kind of like initial payoff, Mr. Bukhari. But if Pakistan does not build this pipeline, there's a penalty to pay, up to $3 million a day. Who pays that penalty then?
That's a good question. Certainly the Pakistanis don't have the money to pay for it. So let's say that the Pakistanis and the Saudis reach an understanding, and I'm not sure if it's final yet, that, okay, we're scrapping this entire pipeline deal, we're going full on board with you, and we still have an obligation. And there are already the Iranian members of parliament are saying that we should take this up with the Pakistanis, that they're committed to building the pipeline, and if they don't, then there are penalties. So they're already reminding them of the money that'll become due. So will the Saudis help the Pakistanis and say, well, we really need your help, and we don't want you doing this with Iran. Don't worry about the penalty. We'll take care of it.
Okay, now the other big thing is the Saudi Arabia, the Iranian nukes, the thing that U.S. is talking to Iran about. And Saudi Arabia has told several U.S. diplomats, if Iran gets nukes, then we get nukes. And recently, it's been in the news that Saudi Arabia, of course, will not build its own nukes. That would take decades. What it will do is it'll just have Pakistan give it nukes. Do you find that theory plausible?
Well, it's certainly a plausible theory. The Saudis have given Pakistan's defense, intelligence, and scientific military communities hundreds of millions of dollars over the years, if not billions. So those relationships are extremely close. Some believe that there's an explicit or implicit quid pro quo in there for nuclear weapons. Now, obviously, any quid pro quo of that sort would involve an enormous commitment problem. Because even if Saudi Arabia has given this money in the past, it doesn't mean that Pakistan would feel any requirement to actually deliver in the future. So that's an open question, and one in which the United States could have some leverage over Pakistani or Saudi decision-making. There are two main scenarios in which Pakistan could provide this sort of technology to the Saudis. One would be actually giving nuclear weapons over. BBC Newsnight actually cited a source recently suggesting that such weapons are ready for delivery if the Saudis want them. There's also talk of a dual key scenario in which Pakistani nuclear forces could potentially be deployed to Saudi Arabia, but would actually maintain control over those weapons themselves.
Okay. Now, Mr. Bukhari, A, do you find this theory plausible? And B, if this happens, if Saudi Arabia does come to Pakistan and say, we gave you so many billions of dollars, now we need the nukes, give them to us, how can Pakistan react? And if it does give Saudi Arabia nukes one way or the other, what would be the fallout?
Well, I think we need to go to the beginning of this, and what the Saudis are saying. They're saying that if the Iranians get nukes, then we're going to go for nukes as well. And as I said earlier, I'm not sure that the Iranians will have a deliverable device. Certainly not if this negotiation moves forward. And so then the question is, what is the reality of this entire story? It's pretty fantastic, if you will. It's incredible, if you will. And so, how does if you look at the logistics and the technical aspect of it. So how do the Pakistanis park their nukes in Saudi Arabia, without being detected by the United States? And, if you do that kind of proliferation, you're running into problems. Pakistan has already been through all sorts of problems because of the quote-unquote AQ Khan network that engaged in proliferation to Iran, to Libya, and the threat was that it could go to non-state actors. Do the Pakistanis want to go back there? I doubt that. I think that if nukes were involved, if the Saudis know that if they cross this line, then the United States is going to behave with them very, very differently. I mean, even right now, there's a lot of, yes, there is tension, but it's not as if the relationship has become completely sour. But this would be a red line. I don't think that the United States is going to tolerate that. Certainly the Pakistanis are not ready to anger the United States, and I do not think that the conflict with Iran, from the Saudi point of view, is as such that they will go so far as to say, well, you know what, we're going to get Pakistani nukes. You want to add something to it?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up. Kamran, I think, is making some excellent points, but I would have a slightly different conclusion on some of them. In particular, he said, certainly not if these negotiations move forward, but just as the Iranians are cheating on their oil export numbers right now based on the joint, the JPA, it's extremely likely that they could also cheat on weapons delivery. And then the question becomes, what does the U.S. do, but also what do the Saudis and Pakistanis do? Just as the Saudis and Pakistan could face significant penalties on this issue, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't overcome them. For instance, in the 1990s, it's been said that one of the reasons that the first Sharif government was able and encouraged to pursue its first nuclear tests was actually because the Saudis guaranteed them discounted oil. And so the Saudis were able to encourage Pakistan to overcome some disincentives then. It could possibly happen again. If there's going to be a Pakistani leader who does it, Sharif may be that man. And just because such a scenario seems fantastical, it may be likely, it may be unlikely. I think Kamran is raising a fair point in that regard, but just the severity of the consequences of such a scenario, especially because it could then trigger a Middle Eastern nuclear cascade to other countries such as Egypt or Turkey, just that severity means that intelligence officials need to look at the possibility that such a scenario could occur with seriousness.
Mr. Bukhari, do you think Dr. Weinberg has a point? A, in the 90s, Pakistan overcame the penalties, and B, the Egyptian military very recently didn't go the way the U.S. wanted it to go, and actually went the way the Saudis wanted them to go, because they said, don't worry about any penalties, we'll take care of the cash.
I think David is making a valid point. I mean, obviously, I couldn't go into too many details. I agree with him that one can't be too sure about the implications of each move. But I do want to point out something, is that what happened in the 90s was not that the Pakistanis were giving weapons to a second country, and publicly, if you will. It was that they were going to do a test, and they had the Saudi financial umbrella to say, okay, even if the U.S., the Clinton administration, imposes sanctions on you, we can still help out. And of course, as you mentioned, Aisha, the Sisi regime is being helped by the Saudis and their Gulf allies, even as they're coming under pressure from the United States. But I think that the entire idea that one country would give nuclear weapons to another country, an allied country, I think that is a completely different ballgame. And I think that the Pakistanis and the Saudis are going to think many, many, many times before they actually move forward on this, if they do at all.
And it's not just the U.S., the European Union, which has given Pakistan so many trade benefits. The whole world will be against Pakistan. I don't even think even China would be in favor of it. But let's move on to how will Iran react if Pakistan does some of these things Saudi Arabia wants it to do, kill the pipeline, help it in Syria. It's already helped them in Bahrain. What is Iranian reaction going to be towards Pakistan? And that's a border country.
Yeah, well, I think the border is one of the most significant flashpoints in this relationship, and one of the areas where Iran could turn up the heat. Just in the last month or so, the Iranians actually threatened a cross-border incursion into Pakistan over some of these issues, and so it's important to consider that relationship could heat up on the border as well as on the pipeline, or perhaps when it comes to Syria. Imagine that a Pakistani man-portable air defense system is used and shoots down an Iranian transport plane flying into Damascus. What happens then, and are the Pakistanis held accountable?
What happens then, Mr. Bukhari?
I think David is right. That is not something that the Iranians are going to take lightly. I just heard today from a source in the Iranian government that there's an intense amount of pressure that the IRGC is bringing to bear in the National Security Council meetings on this whole issue of going across the border into Pakistan because of the abduction of the 5 border guards, and that the Pakistanis are not doing what needs to be done. And on top of that, they're making the case that this is a country that's allied with Saudi Arabia. This is a country that is possibly allowing these people to operate with Saudi backing. And look, they're already in some sort of a negotiation on supporting rebels in Syria. and training them and providing them with weapons. So this is a hostile country, and we need to treat it. The Rouhani administration is trying very hard to say, no, hold your horses. We're not going to get ahead of ourselves. Our main goal is to negotiate this nuclear deal and deal with Syria. We can't open up a new front.
Okay, thank you so much. Our time today is up. I wish we could talk more, a very interesting topic, but I need to thank my guest, Dr. David Weinberg, a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Kamran Bukhari. He's the Vice President for Mideast and South Asia in Stratford. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please come back next week for another episode of Access Point.